Hello, and welcome to all of the truth seekers that have joined us today from around the world. I'm glad that you decided to join this online community. For the next hour, GMDC will help you uncover new ideas that will push your thinking inside and outside of your business. My name is Mark McKelsey, and I lead the people and the projects that bring you insights, shopper trends, and next practices from Global Market Development Center. This Infocast will make your lunch hour profitable by demonstrating just how the curiosity and the power of the consumer must be at the center of your strategy. In other words, the way you've done things in the past is not the way that your future success will happen. Retailers and brands more than ever must be adaptive and in constant flux in order to connect with evolving populations. So how you respond to this session is keenly important. Without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm coming to you live from Colorado Springs and have Wade from AT Kearney joining us from St. Louis today. Today's Infocast will help you understand why so many people want brands, stores, and websites to talk to them in a purposeful, personal, and meaningful way, but also what is that great responsibility that we have as an industry of using that data and where's it going? Data today is a big deal, especially since cognitive technologies are on the rise and machine learning is still in its infancy stages. As marketers used to rely on the intuition when it came to understanding their customers, today it's all about data and data-driven methodologies. In the old days, when marketers used to use data, by the time it was implemented correctly, it was out of touch. But today, real-time data flows freely, and marketers not only revel in the pool of data and have the ability to execute quicker than ever before, they were also becoming overwhelmed in consumer segmentation and profiling. Since big data provides marketers with new insights across hundreds of platforms and helps them connect the dots from end to end in the purchase lifecycle, what companies need to understand is that the world has shifted from campaigns to customer recognition. The relationship between a brand and the value that it holds with a human is worth a ton of gold in today's economy. Consumers are bombarded with messaging and distractions consistently. And if they're not given the right information at the right time for the right price, brand loyalty is easily swayed. The benefit of understanding new consumer data also comes in the form of allowing it to change your brand and store experiences and being immediately responsive to what digital behavior is telling you. While shopping online cannot be mimicked precisely in a brick and mortar environment, it certainly can have a large influence of suggested selling and top-of-mind strategies. But, and this is the crux of what we'll discuss today, the bigger question remains, what is the future of that data? Who truly owns it? And where will it reside as it becomes more and more complex? Consumers know that where they shop, what they buy, and what they look at can all be tracked. So ultimately, as privacy issues arise and consumers become more aware about what others know about them, where do these brands and stores go from here? With that said, Wade, would you help our viewers know a bit more about what they're going to learn today?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. I think you've really touched on it in the intro, and to build on that, as we've explored this topic, we've recognized that despite a surplus of data and the recognized need for action, consumers really have not found that meaningful personalized experience. Along with that, the value of data remains largely untapped, and consumers, for the most part, are trading that data with little to no return. The big force that's really impacting this are regulatory decisions that we know about in Europe in GDPR, as well as starting in the US with the law in California that are clarifying consumer data ownership. This, in our mind, is allowing a market to develop beyond the current environment. Right now, a void exists in the value chain for a consumer advocate who acts on behalf of the consumer and secures adequate compensation in exchange for data. We believe a first mover could define this market, quickly build scale, and capture the value. We've also explored some consumer research to see that consumers are interested in monetizing this data, but will require trust and simplicity to actively engage. In today's presentation, we'll dive into this topic in much more detail.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to it. Before we get started and dive in, I'd like to remind our viewers that we'll take questions during or after the session by simply using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat button, but please use the Q&A. That's where we look for those questions, and we'll get to that at the end. So let's get started. Back over to you, Wade.
Sounds great. Thanks, Mark. to tee up the presentation. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Today we want to talk about that evolving consumer data landscape and what that means for brands around the world. And as Mark mentioned, I'm a manager in our consumer goods and retail practice at A.T. Kearney. One of the key factors as we think about engaging with our clients is really around putting that consumer first, whether that's sales and marketing activities all the way through procurement and back office. The focus for us is really around thinking and approaching problems with the consumer at the top of mind and working from there. As we've done that in conversations we've been engaging with our clients, the topic of consumer data has been a frequent one, as I'm sure you can all imagine, and as I'm sure is very top of mind for many of you. Through these conversations, we realized that there wasn't a lot of clarity or understanding of what is that future going to be. There's, as Mark mentioned in the intro, a lot of data is collected. We as consumers ourselves are providing that data, and companies are trying to and actively focused on what to do with that and what does that mean for them? How do they best capitalize on that as an asset? That was really the jumping off point for us, and we said there's clearly something here. There's a desire to know more and an unclear view on what does that future hold and what is the opportunity. So that was our starting point, and through there we believe we've unlocked an opportunity in a new market that is ready and ripe to emerge. To ground us all, as we think about this, really what we realized very early on is that consumer data stretches beyond a single category, but is also very siloed. Even with some of the large data giants that we all think of and interact with on a daily basis, whether that's Google, Facebook, Amazon, they still, in most companies, really are just kind of getting a sliver of a single individual consumer's data. And to really get that full view of a consumer overall, you have to start to span and break down some of these silos. And that's where we've really see an opportunity is a first mover who's able to get into that space and also have a better, more complete view of the consumer is going to be able to better capitalize and market better to that consumer because they're going to understand their wants and needs in a more complete and personalized way. For us, there's a number of forces that are starting to impact this and really evaluating and setting up what that future can look like. We believe that there's a big shift that's happening with the consumer today from more of affluence to an influence-led consumer marketing. So as consumers overall are moving away from being brand specific to more of an influencer and wanting to understand and align better with the values and beliefs of a brand that they're interacting with, they know they've got much more options out there available and are able to more easily shift between brands. So knowing that consumer is really going to be important in how you interact and best capitalize on their spending power. This also, in our mind, really increases the value of the data available. The more the data, the more complete and more accurate that you have, the better you're going to be able to understand and know your consumer. And that's really going to be the differentiating factor. The second force we know that's impacting this is evolving consumer expectations. This started years ago with Amazon and the way that they've really set the marketplace and the expectations we all now have in terms of a retail experience as well as a supply chain experience. But moving beyond that, traditionally marketers would look at a number of maybe 8 to 12 archetypes and really use that as their way to market to the masses. However, the consumer today is really self-defining, and they're defining across an almost limitless amount of dimensions. So that has a huge impact on how I expect to be marketed to, or I want to interact with brands versus someone else. I'm no longer meet just your traditional archetypes, but I'm an individual, and there's a number of factors that make me who I am, and that impacts how I want to be marketed to and how I want to be interacted with. The last piece, and I touched on this a little bit in the summary up front, is the clarity of data ownership. This to us is really the paradigm shifting activity that's currently happening. So I'm assuming most folks are very familiar with GDPR at this point. It has had major implications for companies who operate globally. But we also have the law in California that is set to go into place starting in January of 2020 that will really change the way companies have to interact with consumers and what it means from an ownership standpoint. The key item here is that consumers will own their data. And that's very different from today's environment where consumers are providing data knowingly and unknowingly in a variety of formats and really have no control over what happens after that. These laws are establishing that that will not be the case, and consumers will have more control in requesting their data to be deleted or asking for it in a format that can be transported to another entity based on their own discretion. That is really the key point and our basis for why we believe that there's a new opportunity that can emerge. We believe that with those forces that I mentioned previously, that there's an opportunity for what we're calling a consumer data agent to emerge. If you think about today, right now, we as consumers largely trade our data for little to no value. It's either for free services or coupons or similar more gimmicky type activities. And largely the monetization of that data sits within the companies that collect it, whether that's third parties who are scraping that data off the internet or the entities themselves that we're directly interacting with. They're able to take and use that data to better market towards us. As the paradigm shifts and the consumer owns the data and has the power to decide who has access to that, this opens an opportunity for an agent to step in and really act on behalf of the consumer. Because as we know, as an individual consumer is not very valuable to a large brand, but as you expand and the law of large numbers, a number of consumers or a mass of consumers are valuable. So having that agent step in and really collect and act as an advocate for consumers at large, that the opportunity does exist. And the way we see this playing out is consumers would align themselves with a consumer data agency. That data agency would be responsible for collecting data from the consumers and other formats that we'll speak to in a subsequent slide. And they would be responsible for monetizing that on the back end. So they would now have access to a data set, as we mentioned in the first page, that is much more complete for an individual consumer based on that consumer's willingness to on what they're willing to share. And we'll talk about how what their willingness to share could impact the value. They now become a central point to retailers, to brands, to any company who's looking to access and market to consumers as a much better and more robust data set that they can now have access to. That doesn't mean that they don't still have the ability to collect their own data, but we believe that this consumer data agent can really build better scale in a more robust fashion and offer this as a service to these companies. And the big change from today's model is that the consumer becomes compensated in some form or fashion. That could be in the form of cash or true monetization, but it could also be in other services or product offerings. That I think is really to be defined, but that's the big change here is that the consumers would be providing this their data to a central location. They would be receiving some sort of compensation for that data, and that then it becomes the agent's job, no different than any other sort of agent model, that to monetize that on the back end with buyers who are interested in accessing that data. To bring to life a bit more of how we see this model working is you would have this consumer data agency become this central point of data collection. And the consumers would be providing data. We could see this almost in the form of a survey to capture and access some of your more simple demographic interests type data. But also, as we mentioned, the regulations coming will authorize access to that data directly from the companies who are collecting it today. So the California law states that consumers will be able to, on a twice-a-year basis, request that the data collected on them for the previous 6 months be provided. And we see this model emerging that the agency would almost be able to step in and do this on their behalf. So collect that data from various companies who are collecting it through your different interactions, whether that's mobile, online, or in traditional brick and mortar. But as that data is attributed to an individual consumer, that consumer owns that data and they would be able to provide it. And then they would also be able to link their access to various forms. So as you have different profiles and online accounts, you could also link that in. So as I mentioned, this will be able to span those silos and break down those silos to various data forms. And then it really becomes the consumer's preference on how much of that data that they're willing to share. As we thought this out, we knew it was going to be important to understand what does this market look like and what is the opportunity here, because it needs to be sizable to really be impactful and to raise the interest of potential companies who would think about entering into this space. We believe that there's at a minimum a $7+ billion opportunity. Based on today's digital advertising spend, as well as the current data broker market, a conservative estimate of $1,000 per year per consumer in the U.S. Was where we landed on the value of data. That would mean that each consumer actively engaged, either in general consumption or online, on average, their data is worth $1,000. As I mentioned, that we believe that to be a conservative estimate, but in terms of building this out, we're able to confidently set that number and believe it can only go up from there. So our view then is if you're able to get a sizable amount of consumers, even if you're only able to capture a portion of that $1,000, again, being conservative, and then what you value back to the consumer, the numbers quickly add up, and you can see a $7+ billion opportunity that with a conservative growth could quickly grow. This to us means that this is a very viable opportunity and something that is worth further investigating from a business case perspective. As I mentioned, there will be a number of factors that will influence this, both in terms of consumers themselves and how you want to segment. So depending on the type of consumer, their consumption habits, their socioeconomic profile, you really could start to value data in a number of ways, as well as with the information that they're willing to share. A consumer who's willing to share more of that complete data profile will likely data will become more valuable. And as the data is more valuable, they will expect to be compensated for it more. And we'll talk about towards the end of today's presentation why we believe that this is viable and what consumers are saying and thinking about this topic. Part of the questions we get when we tee this up is, well, why should this work? It seems a bit out of left field when you first think about it. We know it's a very big change from the current interaction model that consumers have as it relates to their data. But we believe that there's a number of existing models that prove this to be viable. If you think about banking, and that was kind of our initial thought when we started to flesh out this idea, is if we talk about data as currency, today it really doesn't operate that way. So why would it not need more of a banking model to really be viewed and operate as a currency, where we as consumers would make deposits as we do today with our data to the companies that collect it, and the company, the bank is then allowed to take and loan that data out, no different than they loan money, which they collect interest on. We also, as consumers who are providing our currency to those institutions, receive a form of currency or compensation in the form of interest. We think that same model works with data. Provide your data to this consumer agency. They're allowed to monetize that on the back end, but you would receive a form of compensation for the data that you do deposit. Similarly, when you think about collegiate sports marketing, a small school in Michigan really does not have much bargaining power and is not a viable sponsorship partner for Nike or for Coca-Cola. However, IMG saw this as an opportunity to bundle these schools and take all of the smaller Division II, Division III schools in a certain area and bundle them together and then sell their rights for different marketing purposes to a large brand that wants to sponsor, and now becomes viable on both sides. So again, I think this speaks to the opportunity that it really does have to reach scale. A small set or an individual consumer is really not valuable, but if you were to bundle it up, it does become a sizable market that has value to brands that want to market to those consumers. And even the real estate model, we believe, also shows this to be viable. If you think about real estate agents, really take a small percentage, and the value largely lies with the buyers and sellers in terms of selling their asset and receiving compensation, and the buyer receiving compensation in the form of that asset that they can then utilize in a variety of ways. We do think that there is a need to move on this quickly, and that's something that we've started to engage in conversations is who can step in and who would be willing to step in. As I'm sure you're digesting this information, you can recognize that if somebody steps in and sets this market, they're going to really establish what that value is. And if they choose that to be 1,000 or more or less, it really becomes the starting point, and everyone after that point is really going to be playing catch up. It's also really a white space, and as consumers, we're not interacting in this way, and that first mover really gets to set the rules of engagement. If you think about the average consumer, and one of my colleagues always quotes the fact that I think less than 50% of Americans have $400 or less in their bank account. If you start talking about offering a $500 a year compensation for data, that becomes real money very quickly to a lot of people. And how you set that up, how you want the model to work, how the compensation works, whether that is monetary or otherwise, really gets defined by the first person to step in. And as we know, when you have that new entrant emerge and that startup really shifts the dynamics of a marketplace, the rest of folks will be playing catch up and not able to capture the value as quickly or as much of it as that first mover. We're also really at an inflection point. Consumers today are becoming more and more aware, and we've got some data to support that. But with the privacy, with data privacy being a daily topic in the news cycle, consumers are becoming more and more aware. That doesn't exactly mean that their behaviors are changing, as I think we know. It has to some extent, but probably not as much as certain stories will lead you to believe. But the knowledge and the interest in this topic is increasing. That, I think, is true. And if that's the case, then soon you're going to reach a point where consumers are going to be smart enough to know what their data is worth and want and recognize that they are valuable. So that to me means that you're at a key point in time where this opportunity is such that it can become realistic very quickly. And we've already started to see some consequences of inaction. The first article you see here, and this was very eye-opening to us, was earlier this year. The California government essentially proposed this as an idea, something that the government in California could step in. And I think as you think about the various brands and companies across the country, that it becomes very scary, because as we know, if the government comes in and set the rules, it likely means it will become costly to the other companies. And that's why we think that there's an opportunity for someone to step in and actually set this and establish this market themselves, and putting the consumer first. It also means that there's data costs can increase and competitive advantages will be challenged. So for the companies that aren't going to step into this space, it likely means that they will have increased data costs if they want to remain competitive. And that to us is an opportunity for someone to get ahead of that and not be caught behind. The reality is that there isn't a single entity really poised to step into this space, and different industries will face different challenges on the path to establishing this consumer data agency. You've got a number of different players. As we've talked with different financial institutions, they believe that they've got a right to play here and think they've really got it figured out. I think for us that is a bit alarming, because it is something that is significant and is a paradigm shift. So if you think you've already got it solved, the fact that it doesn't really exist today leads us to believe that that's probably not the case. And we'll talk here in a second around what those different success factors are, but really different companies are going to face different challenges, and to overcome those challenges, we think that there's really an opportunity for some more unnatural alliances or unnatural partnerships as a way to break down some of these barriers to success, whether that's in smaller acquisitions and to build capabilities, or in partnership of larger incumbents to expand from there, to expand the data access they have, given the complementary data sets that different companies may have. If a media company and a financial institution were to come together with the access that media companies have to consumers, as well as to buyers of marketing, and then the information a financial institution has in terms of individual consumer buying power and financial status, that becomes a very relevant and intriguing opportunity for a joint venture of sorts to really set in and establish this marketplace. As we were doing our research, we recognized that this market has started to emerge, just in a small scale. There are a number of emerging data agents that are stepping in and vying to define the rules. They are in much smaller scale, and many times they're a little more in a niche space, whether that's focused in the medical space or otherwise. But there are a number of examples from some of the companies you can see here of companies that have built a transparent marketplace where they have engaged consumers to provide data through various forms, whether that's search and browser history or activation on a mobile device that they are able to then track. The key point there being the transparency piece. I think that's going to be really critical, and we'll speak some more about that in a subsequent slide. But through that transparency and that data collection, they're then compensating those consumers for their data. Many times they're doing that through forms of cryptocurrency, which obviously faces its own challenge in terms of being able to to mobilize, but the fact remains that at various levels of scale, that these companies have built small marketplaces that prove this to be a viable model. Really, the biggest challenge for these companies is overcoming the scale challenge. And that, in our mind, is really there's really three key success factors. Trust, which will probably sound like a no-brainer, but really will have an important say in who's able to do this, and is this an opportunity, and how real can this be? As I mentioned, the privacy and data leaks, news stories are very top of mind for most consumers. So consumers are going to have to trust that if they're going to be opening up and sharing more and more complete data, that they know that they can trust whoever that is. And as we know, certain brands will face more challenges than others when it comes to the trust factor, given some actions that may have happened historically. Second is scale. As I mentioned, that's really the challenge that those emerging data agents are facing. You need to be large enough, both from a resource standpoint to build and establish this at a large enough scale to be to matter, but also to have that ability to reach a broad enough consumer base to collect and build a sizable base that the buyers will want to, it will matter to buyers, because it has to reach a critical mass that it becomes a population that they can market to in an effective way. And that really does build into that last point around access to buyers. And this is another challenge that some of the emerging startups face, is you need to have access to those brands, to those retailers, to those companies who are willing to spend marketing budgets and have a desire to get in front of consumers in a targeted and personalized way. There are going to be certain companies who obviously already are incumbents who have this access because of the models that they already operate in. But that to us is a key point. But you could have all the scale in the world and be able to cast the net wide enough and build a large enough consumer base to provide the data. However, as soon as you do that, you're going to have consumers who are looking to be compensated. So you need to be able to have the back end of the value chain where you are able to access the buyers willing to pay for it. So as I mentioned, we developed this idea. We pressure tested it with a number of companies to get their perspectives and discuss potential opportunity. But to go back to my original point, we know that the consumer stands at the middle of this, and the consumer is a key player that we need to understand their appetite for this. So we conducted a survey of 1,000 consumers representative of the U.S. population to get their perspectives on overall trust and comfort across organizations around the idea of transparency and data capture, and then really finally on the valuation and monetization of their data, and what the appetite is for an opportunity like this consumer data agency. So I'd like to share some of the results of that survey. Really, not surprising, the data security was a non-starter. If you have poor data security, customers recognize that as something that they will actively shy away from brands. If it's perceived that their data is not going to be secure, that becomes an inhibitor for the consumer wanting to engage. However, the more interesting piece to us was the ability to control data. Greater than 60% of consumers identified the three factors below as something that they highly value when it comes to their data. That ability to easily erase their data, being informed of data breaches, and being able to access and track that data. This was really enlightening to us because, as I mentioned, the regulatory piece will establish that consumers will have the rights to do these things. However, just because a regulatory change establishes that, consumers will have to act on it for it to be meaningful. This gave us the trust and the belief in the fact that that will happen. Consumers want this. It's something that they desire and will actively pursue. We also wanted to understand, as we think about this opportunity, where does that trustworthiness lie? And I think there was not a lot of surprises here. There's definitely perceived trust in the types of organizations that hold some of your most sensitive information. Healthcare providers, financial institutions are perceived as more trustworthy. Whether or not that's factually the case, as we know with certain data breaches that have occurred, that's not always the case, but consumers have a belief that as it comes to their sensitive data, as well as being some industries that have government regulation already installed, whether that's HIPAA or FDIC, that there is a level of trust that they can come to expect. Similarly, on the other side of the spectrum, when it comes to least trustworthiness, some of the media firms and social media that we see in the news for a variety of reasons related to data show up on the lower end of the spectrum. And this goes to our point on who's going to be able to build that trust. We think this is a key factor to understand where the consumer perception lies currently. We also asked what type of information that they were most comfortable sharing. So if you remember that sort of rainbow chart at the beginning, we had defined a number of what that spectrum of data types look like. And this was really very interesting in terms of what's that information they're comfortable sharing, both from a demographics and beliefs. Our read on this was more that that's information that they're more actively asked for and recognize that they are sharing and are comfortable with that. Activity was an interesting one, and understanding is that as that relates to more of like a Fitbit type activity tracker, but if that starts to step into the lane of being location based, there was less comfortable in sharing that type of data. The really interesting thing on that least comfortable sharing is that most of the types of data that were recognized is data that we know is very much available and is actively shared by consumers. If you think about credit scores, that's one of the most common data points shared in consumers in a variety of ways, whether that comes to buying and leasing houses and cars or other transactions. That's readily available and provided in a number of ways. Location is something that many consumers don't recognize but are actively sharing through their mobile devices. And contact info, email addresses is probably the most common shared data. If you think about it, every time you go to a different website, you provide it just to get your 10% off coupon. Our read on this was that the information as it becomes more attributable to an individual consumer, so my contact information specifically, and thinking about that being shared more broadly, becomes more personal and thus something I'm less comfortable with sharing, whereas some of the other pieces that may not be the case. So as I mentioned, we also wanted to get a view on monetization. So understanding what's important to consumers, who are they willing to share information with, and what are they willing to share. We also wanted to know, do they understand what these opportunities that exist? Overall, half of respondents half respondents were unaware of ways, and about a third were aware. But we saw that increase as we looked at the younger demographic in 18 to 34-year-olds, and leads us to believe, and as our demographics shift and as that population becomes the majority of buying power, that they are increasingly aware and as they're aware, they will want to take advantage of those opportunities. We also wanted to understand what is it that consumers would accept as a form of compensation. Not surprisingly, monetary compensation led the way and is really the preferred amount. But really, what we saw is that they just want a reasonable return. As they're more aware of the value of their data, there's an expectation that there is some sort of fair market value and fair trade that needs to happen in terms of that data, whether that's through products, coupons, or services. And lastly, we wanted to get a view on how consumers perceive the value of their data. As we said, our analysis showed that consumer data is conservatively estimated at $1,000 per year. And when we looked at the survey respondents, they weren't far off in terms of what they perceived their value to be, just shy of $900 annually. As we dug into more of the data, and we won't get into that level of granularity today, but there's interesting in how that shifts in terms of different types of data and what that means. But overall, we thought it was very encouraging that consumers were not significantly far off from what we believe data to actually be worth, because we know that that's not always the case in terms of perception and reality. Finally, we did see strong interest in the use of a data agent or similar model, whether that be app-based or otherwise. And really, consumers overall overwhelmingly are interested in this when we posed it as a potential opportunity. For them, the feedback we got was really that a strong reputation, data protection, and ease of access were going to be the factors in decisioning. And that to us really does lead back to that trust factor that we talked about as a key to success. That's going to be critical. The transparency that goes along with that, really the view that the consumer needs to come first in this model, which is the large shift from today, is what has to come across for this to be successful and for consumers to buy in. So the last piece I'll kind of leave on is what would it take to actually do this, because we recognize that this is not something that you just ideate on and flip a switch and happens overnight. In our mind, there's kind of three key factors to really build that business case and explore this as an opportunity. I touched on it briefly, but I think the partnerships one is worth repeating. It's very unlikely in our mind that a single entity is able to step in and do this on their own. As we mentioned with some of the emerging contenders, they just don't have the scale. As we talked about with some of today's large incumbents, they face challenges on those different success factors. Even the largest data giants today, they largely struggle with the trust component that, as we mentioned, is probably the most critical in setting this up. The economics is obviously going to be critical, and this is something that will have to be further vetted. What does that consumer acquisition look like? How do you reach a consumer base that becomes large enough in scale to matter to the buyers and the marketers who would want to have access to them? And also, how do you accelerate that revenue generation? So as soon as you sign these consumers up and set that expectation in some form of compensation, you need to have the value chain on the back end to cover those costs. And then lastly, there's, as I'm sure you all can imagine, there's a clear technology component to this, understanding current capabilities, evaluating some emerging technologies. We do think there's a role that a blockchain can play in this from a data security standpoint, but also making sure you're designing for the consumer experience. At the end of the day, for this to be successful, it's around switching that paradigm and putting the consumer at the center of the value chain and making sure that the consumers are really receiving that fair and adequate compensation. And we believe for the consumer agency to work, that not only has to be perception, but it does have to be reality. Today, the consumer is not able to actively participate in the value chain. And really the switch in our mind is that they are seeing and feel that they have an advocate operating on their behalf to make sure that they're being fairly represented and fairly compensated. So that is the end of the presentation. And with that, I will turn it back to Mark and open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Wade. We do have a few questions, so we'll go ahead and get to those right now. Wade, Sean is asking, what does this mean for companies who are actively engaged in consumer data collection and or consumer data monetization?
Thanks, and thanks. I think that's a great question. It certainly has implications, and that's something that we've been actively engaging with different clients on to understand is what are their current views on this, and how have they already started to think about some of these things as folks recognize and have already started to adapt for some of the regulatory changes. I think in my mind, a couple of key things that come to mind is how are you actively and being prepared for the level of transparency that is going to be required, and doing that in a way that is going to be both regulatory compliant, but also in a way that consumers are comfortable with and will want to continue to actively engage with you as a brand and as a company. I think the other piece here is starting to crack the code on personalization, which we did touch on in the beginning, is that what happens in this model is consumers start to share more and more complete data, but that also raises the expectations even more. And in our mind, there is a number of work that needs to be done, whether that's by a company who steps into this space, but by everyone else who will have to now operate in this space, is how are they actively how are they going about operationalizing their data and building mechanisms that can better put their products and services in front of the consumer at the right time, with the right products and services that consumer is looking for.
Mallory's asking, does an incumbent or a new entrant stand a better chance at establishing a consumer data agency?
Thanks. I think, again, we touched on this a little in the presentation, but in our mind, I think a consortium of incumbents is probably the most viable path to establishing the consumer data agency. As we mentioned, the new entrants really face scale issues and access to buyers that will be difficult to overcome. But if a consortium or a partnership of two or more companies were to step in, I think that would be viable. We do recognize that this does need to be a newly established entity. Even just from a regulatory standpoint, they would need to be standalone from the existing incumbents, but they would have a faster path to success than a new entrant.
Got it. Well, that's all the questions that we have for today. Wade, thanks again for your partnership, and especially with your organization, AT Kearney, for being on our council and leading many of our insightful projects such as this.
Thank you.
If this is your first time experiencing a GMDC Infocast, I'd like to make sure that you are aware that this session and all previous Infocast events can be viewed on the archive tab on gmdcconnect.org, along with a schedule to register for future events. I'd also like to encourage you to get involved with GMDC in retail tomorrow and become a member. Today's Infocast is a small sample of what members have access to. GMDC is a nonprofit retail-owned association that helps connect people and companies to growth and opportunities in the general merchandise, health, beauty, wellness, and self-care industries. For more information, please contact me at markm@gmdc.org. I'd love to help you find opportunities to get your company exposed to decision makers and other executives that can change your business. Thanks again for joining us today. Take care.